Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. Looming and eye-popping federal debt levels. We're talking trillions of dollars of deficit, no matter who wins the election. Do voters know?
I love this. Campaign plans are often vaguer, and estimating policies isn't an exact science.
And would they do anything about it? Veteran Wall Street watcher Abby Joseph Cohen joins us.
How do you figure this out?
And a first anniversary of the deadly Hamas attack in Israel. Where are we now? Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League.
So what I would say to leaders today, corporate leaders, elected officials, college presidents, on this day, you remember those innocent 1,200 people. No equivocation.
Plus, Pfizer in an activist's crosshairs, insuring Cybertruck drivers, and Elon Musk hits the campaign trail with former President Donald Trump.
Michael Jordan always said, Republicans buy sneakers too.
Right.
Democrats buy Teslas too.
It's Monday, October 7th, 2024. Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick, along with Joe Kernan and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Another kind of a fallen angel, I guess.
Talk about this one.
Pfizer. You look at where the stock is. Activist Starboard Value has taken a roughly $1 billion stake in this $29 stock and is seeking to mount a turnaround at the struggling company. That's according to sources familiar with the matter that say that the activist has approached former Pfizer CEO Ian Reed and the company's ex-CFO Frank D'Amelio. Both have expressed interest in supporting Starboard Board's turnaround effort. I'm sure they might have some Pfizer left. They're probably not happy shareholders at this point. The sources say that Starboard believes the current leadership under CEO Albert Bourla has stepped away from its historically disciplined cost structure and investment in novel drugs. When asked about the report, a Pfizer spokesperson declined to comment on speculation or the rumor, but there's no doubt that
drug companies are very hard for activists to do well in.
Yeah.
In terms of, there's very few sort of financial engineering things you can do with a drug company.
If you haven't invested in new drugs and you had all your bets on COVID and the response to COVID and the vaccine for COVID.
But the other things that
Where's
happened.
their weight loss entrance?
They failed on the weight loss. They had a weight loss drug that didn't work.
Yeah. Right.
They have invested heavily in cancer drugs, and they're still probably 2, 3, 4, even 5 years out from knowing whether those things will work. The reason I say it's very complicated to see an activist and a drug maker is typically to make a drug maker successful, you need to make investments. It's not about sending dividends back to shareholders or breaking companies up or doing something. You would actually have to fundamentally, this is an operational story, and typically with a pharmaceutical company, it's a long-term operational story, which is, it's not like in 2 years you can somehow right the ship.
I can remember a couple times when Nelson Peltz was approaching some targets and people said, what do you possibly know about, was it Disney or I don't know, the company was, but what do you want to do exactly besides what you said, more buybacks, this, that, or the other thing. It does help. And for a drug company, I mean, if you're just an average activist, what do you know about R&D or where you ought to place your bets for the future? That's
what I'm saying. It's good. This is going to be a hard one.
But maybe, a lot of companies are hard to run.
But maybe part of their argument is there are some activists that have gotten involved in things that have hung around the hoop for a very long time. I mean, we always, critique the Carl Icahns of the world, but he would tell you that the length of time that he was in a stock was actually much longer than the average person who's in a stock. So maybe you think Starboard gets in there and they bring Ian in and put him on the board and they at least force the hand of the company to rethink leadership. I don't know if you really think this is the wrong leadership.
Do you remember during the pandemic when basically they brought these vaccines out and stopped everything at the company and focused on this and did things that people said were not possible, that you could never get through the regulatory process that quickly, that you could never bring something to market. And Bourla was hailed as a hero at that point for rallying the troops and getting them to do something that no one thought was possible in that amount of time, in under a year and a half.
But then I remember Carl, whether he looked into things, Carl Icahn, and you remember that story was with Milan and King, and he admitted it when he called us. He said, I was shaving, and I heard on CNBC about King. I said, what? That was enough of his due diligence to figure out he wanted to try and do something there. So I'm not sure.
But that was a transaction.
Right. But I'm not sure any of these guys think that long and hard about a lot of things. It can be a gut instinct, and sometimes obviously it's worked for.
Although sometimes gut instincts, I will say, come over decades and decades of business experience, reading through filings. Right. Well, that's certainly the case with Buffett. He may think about something in the bathtub, but it's because he's spent decades and decades reading every filing that comes out.
Not everyone is Eli Lilly, but if you were to do a Pfizer Eli Lilly 3-year or 5-year chart, it would show you why activists are circling Pfizer, probably.
Former President Trump returned to Butler, Pennsylvania on Saturday night. That is the site of the rally where he was shot in the ear in an assassination attempt back in July. Trump declared the farm grounds a hallowed place.
For 16 harrowing seconds during the gunfire, time stopped as this vicious monster unleashed pure evil from his sniper's perch, not so far away. But by the hand of Providence and the grace of God, that villain did not succeed in his goal.
Elon Musk was on hand to support Trump and spoke to the crowd.
Text people now. Now. And then make sure they actually do vote. If they don't, this will be the last election. That's my prediction. Nothing's more important. Nothing's more important.
Also in attendance, hedge fund billionaire John Paulson and real estate investor Steve Witkoff.
And then he showed up at the Steelers game, Elon Musk, and he had the terrible towel when he's up there and people were cheering, and it didn't actually work for the Steelers. I was just getting caught up on what happened with that game against the Cowboys. And you can read C.D. Lamb's lips on what he's saying to Dak Prescott. And Dak Prescott is sitting on the bench like that. Really? And he's screaming at him after a bad interception. But at the very end, the terrible towel waving of Elon Musk did not help. Right, DeFaber, are you in there? Was that a bad game for you last night? We got some big Steelers fans in our control room. But when it was all said, what's wrong? You mad about Elon going to Trump's thing?
No.
You looked like you were smirking.
He's allowed to make his voice known. I thought it was a little bit surprising that he turned it at the end. I mean, obviously, a lot of Democrats would say that they fear that democracy is on the line and that there won't be another election.
We've seen the polls.
And so it was very interesting to hear him say that he thought that this was the last election.
Well, you remember the poll that said more people were worried about Democrats ending democracy than Republicans. There was a public poll that said that. So it shouldn't be a total surprise that both sides are worried.
I had not seen that poll.
Oh, you can check it out.
I need to focus on that poll.
You know what I was thinking about, though, is how you talk about how Michael Jordan always said, Republicans buy sneakers, too.
Right.
Democrats buy Teslas, too.
When he was with David Faber, I think he said something. He used the F word to describe what he thought of advertisers who weren't going to.
No, that was with Andrew. That was with the Andrew deal.
On you, a favor. Yeah.
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 Don't advertise.
You don't want them to advertise?
No.
What do you mean?
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go yourself.
But
go yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is. Hey, Bob, if you're in the audience.
And he didn't hesitate, and he said about 6 other times. I think,
We said it. I said it a lot.
Yeah.
Said it a lot.
Anyway, he was in Pennsylvania, and from there headed to the. By the way, did you, anyone, Bueller, see the Mets? Did you see any of that?
Oh,
game?
I watched.
It was almost like the Carlton Fisk game.
I didn't see. I told you I watched Thursday night. I didn't get a chance to watch it this weekend because I was at basketball tournaments all weekend, so I didn't.
It was like one for the record books already. I mean, people are talking about what that, and now it's 1-1. So it's a
when
best
I looked
of
up,
3
it was
series.
already like 5-1 the first time I looked at it.
They came storming back, the Phillies, believe me, and then the Mets came storming back. This guy Vientos hit 2 home runs.
Yeah.
It was. I mean, it had everything in it. Castellanos' son was there. He saw him hit a home run, and he saw him hit the triple, or not triple, but to score the walk-off.
It's been unbelievable.
Went over to his son. His son was so excited.
I'm not a Mets fan, but I've not been able to shut it off.
You're going to give Steve Cohen credit for this?
Yeah, I think I am. But no, what I'm going to give credit to is that postseason baseball is better than anything, I think. Maybe during the regular season it's not, but postseason baseball, I don't think NFL or NBA can do it, or anything.
AAU basketball is better.
Huh? Yeah.
I watch about 6 games this week.
If your kid's playing, that you're right. That's even better.
A story in niche auto publication Torque News raising some questions about insurance policies on Tesla Cybertrucks. An owner named Robert Stevenson posted a letter on X saying that Geico will no longer insure his Cybertruck. The letter from Geico reads in part, "This type of vehicle doesn't meet our underwriting guidelines." Stevenson has 8 vehicles. Geico is only said to be terminating coverage on the Cybertruck. Stevenson said in his post that he was going to switch insurers as a result. But the bigger question is whether this was a broader policy shift by Geico. So I did some reporting last night on this, and here's what I've heard back. Back in May, Geico added the Cybertruck to the exotic car list after complaints from customers who couldn't get parts from body shops or repair. Geico says customers tend to blame Geico for these delays, not the body shops or Tesla. And Geico also gets the blame from frustrated customers when their rental replacement vehicle isn't covered for as long as it takes to get the cars repaired. But when notified about this issue, Todd Combs, who is the CEO of Geico, said it wasn't a holistic view of the issue and he's taking another look at this. He also instituted a change in policy. He said Geico is going to be reaching out to the customer this morning and that the company will also be removing the Cybertruck from its exotic car list internally and pre-ordering Cybertruck parts for their own repair shops so that if a customer runs into a delay, they can then direct them to that avenue. But it does get into this interesting story. Insurance rates have gone up pretty significantly. Right. There have been delays for parts in all kinds of cars because of what happened with the supply chain during the pandemic. Maybe a little harder to get parts for vehicles that are niche vehicles, too.
No, when you first said it, I thought it was a safety concern, and it's not.
No, it's just
I've been in one of those.
Geico customers get mad.
The only thing unsafe about it is how fast the thing is. It's unbelievable.
No, but how much of this sort of maneuvering back and forth is that that Geico is worried about Tesla customers being loud?
I don't know. I reached out to Todd, and Todd said this happened without his knowledge of any of this. These decisions get made at lower levels all the time. He said going forward, he wants to know about any issues, any car getting put on these exotic lists.
But I'm just assuming that if it was a GM car or a Ford car or something,
I don't know how much of it's
the passion online and what it can do to your brand and the kind of sort of riot that can emerge in social media is just a completely different level. And so if you are Geico or any company that's in this business, you're having to be more sensitive, let's just to say.
I mean, I will also say it gets a lot more attention when a CNBC anchor reaches out to a CEO
That's
of a company.
true, too.
So, it's going to be promoted in other ways. So, but this is a situation where they said they're changing it. They're reaching out to the customer today.
Tease will be next.
Coming up, Abby Joseph Cohen, a legendary longtime voice of Wall Street as an investment strategist at Goldman Sachs. She called the 1990s bull market and the Y2K internet stock pullback. Today, in 2024, in our fractured politics, she's concerned.
Historically, if you go back many cycles, you see that the U.S. stock market does pretty well. After a major election, there's a sigh of relief, and also most people feel that their candidate has won. This year, I'm not convinced it's going to be a sigh of relief rally.
You're listening to Squawk Pod from CNBC with Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Here's Joe.
New analysis this morning about the economic plans from former President Trump and Vice President Harris, and Megan Cassella joins us now with that story. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Joe. So we're talking specifically today about the fiscal impact of these plans. And the headline here is that the debt goes up under either candidate, but Trump's plans would add roughly twice the amount of debt as Harris's would. Now, that's according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And their baseline estimate says that Harris's plans would add a net $3.5 trillion to the debt, and Trump's would add about $7.5 trillion. Now, the difference here is on both the top and the bottom line. Harris's plans both cost less and they raise more. Her biggest line item is her plan plan to extend the 2017 tax cuts only for anyone making less than $400,000 a year. That'll cost $3 trillion. Expanding the child tax credit would cost $1.4 trillion, but then that's offset by raising the corporate tax rate, which brings in $900 billion, and all those plans to tax capital income, those would raise about $850 billion. Now, for Trump, extending the 2017 tax cuts in full, that alone costs about $5.4 trillion. Eliminating tax on overtime and Social Security, those would together cost another $3.3 trillion. Now, the tariffs would be his main source of revenue. They'd bring in about $2.7 trillion, and his plans to expand energy production and drill for more oil, those would raise about $700 billion. And now one last point here, because I think someone might like to ask about this. This analysis mostly does not take into account changes to GDP, except for in a few key areas. And for the tax cut extension on the Trump side, when faster growth is taken into account, the cost does fall, but only by about $800 billion, leaving the overall cost of those tax cuts alone at about $4.6 trillion on the Trump side. Joe?
Did the any unrealized capital gains assumed would pass? They didn't even put that in there, did they? That's not part of this?
They did. They talked about that in sort of the taxing capital income section. What they said in their methodology was that it is there. Yeah, they said that sort of billionaire minimum tax that Biden has talked about of 25% and unrealized cap gains on over $100 million. They did put that in there. Obviously, there's a lot of caveats in here. They're saying they have to make a lot of assumptions on both sides, but that's in there.
Well, Megan, did you see at the end it says, I love this, campaign plans are often vaguer, more vague than what we know. And estimating policies isn't an exact science. Under the analysis, did you see this? Trump's deficits could be as low as $1.45 trillion or as high as $15 trillion. So it's somewhere between when you really look at what they're able to say. But for Harris, it's still from break even to 8, so it's still double. It could be as low as break even to as high as 8.1 trillion. But I like that the Trump's deficits could be around 1.45 trillion or maybe 15.15 trillion. So I don't know. It just it doesn't give me a lot of faith that we. But I'll tell you what really would blow out Trump's thing, Megan. That is, you extend the tax cuts and you take away the SALT cap. I mean, that's the only way that you were able to pay for the tax cuts in the first place was the SALT cap.
Right. No, I think that's right. Obviously, huge ranges here, Joe, that they have to deal with. What they do get into in their conclusion that I think is interesting is that neither candidate is doing anything, even in terms of lip service at this point, in terms of addressing the debt. Even though Harris, as you said, her low cost estimate is at just about break even, they still say that's not good enough, that they want both of these candidates, both major parties, to be looking at the debt because of the trajectory that it's on. Debt to GDP ratio, I don't know if you saw those numbers in here. The baseline estimate within 10 years, we're already getting to 125%. The Harris estimate gets us to 133%, and Trump to 142%. That's, as you know, Joe, that's when economists start to get worried when the debt grows faster than the economy. That's kind of the path that we're on right now.
Yeah, an inexorable path. I don't know, Megan, whether I believe that a lot of those Harris, to assume that Trump, that the tariffs go in, and to assume that she gets all of her tax cuts through, neither one of those things is very likely to happen. So, but either way, this, which is it's a nonpartisan organization, either way, they're very concerned about both the trajectory that the country is on, regardless of which way we go. All right, thank you.
We want to continue this conversation with a guest we haven't seen in a while. Abby Joseph Cohen is a former partner and chief U.S. strategist at Goldman Sachs, now a professor at Columbia Business School. And Abby, thank you for coming in today.
Good morning.
We look to you for big calls on a lot of different issues. We are looking at new highs. You could say valuations are stretched, but then again, there's not a lot of volatility that leads into this. What do you see when you look at the landscape?
Well, Becky, it's an interesting time because we've had market strategists just recently lift their targets again, not just in the United States, but also in China. And in some ways, they're kind of looking at the momentum. And I always, as you know, like to look at midterm, long-term kind of issues. And from my perspective, I think we're now in a trading range. And there are a few reasons for it. I look at the fundamentals, which are not bad. I think the U.S. economy is in very good shape. Corporate profits this year are in good shape, but a lot of that good news is already baked into the market. I also take a look at the consensus forecasts that are being used for S&P earnings for next year, and many of them are expecting additional earnings growth of 10 to 12% from the strategists, even more than that from the analysts. That represents an acceleration from this year, even though the likelihood is that the U.S. GDP will be growing more slowly next year than this year. We're seeing roughly GDP growth, real GDP growth now of about 3%. It'll probably ease off a little bit to about 2.5%, certainly not a recession, but it's kind of hard to argue that profits are going to accelerate dramatically. And then, of course, there's the valuation question. Valuation is already pricing in some very good news, and that's for the overall market. And of course, there are some sectors that have some issues. My real concern, however, has to do with some of the geopolitical things that we look at. And I start with the U.S. election. Historically, if you go back many cycles, you see that the U.S. stock market does pretty well after a major election. There's a sigh of relief, and also most people feel that their candidate has won. This year, I'm not convinced it's going to be a sigh of relief rally. In fact, if anything, I'm quite concerned about what happens if there is agitation of any sort following the election because of uncertainty about results and so on. So that, to me, is a concern.
Because it's so close, because there have been questions raised about the potential for tampering.
Exactly.
That half the country is going to feel like they got robbed or ripped off.
And there will be candidates out there, not just at the national level, but state and local level, who are already talking about tampering, even though there's no evidence of it. And that's something that concerns me. We also, of course, need to have thoughtful conversations about policy going forward. Either way, we're going to be having a new president with different priorities. And I do very much worry about some of the policy changes that we could be looking at. Some of the ones that have been discussed by some of the candidates look fine to me. Others are quite worrisome.
Which one's concerned you?
Well, you've been running a chyron this morning talking about the forecast, the estimate that's been done by an outside group saying that the Trump plans would add $7.5 trillion to the budget deficit. That's a pretty significant number. I haven't done the numbers myself. I think it's very hard to do so until you actually see legislation and so on. But one of the things that I'm quite concerned about has to do with tariffs. Tariffs are not paid from the country of origin. They're paid ultimately by U.S. consumers. And there's one other thing that us policy wonks are focused on that to me is very, very troubling in terms of ultimate economic activity. And that has to do with the so-called Schedule F plans from the Trump administration. This is something that was put in place at the end of the first Trump administration, something that's discussed in Project 2025. I know that President Trump has disavowed Project 2025, but there are so many of his people behind it. I think we have to look at it seriously. And what does it do? Schedule F basically says, okay, we have 10,000 political appointees in the federal government. What they will do is reclassify an additional 40,000 jobs to become political appointees. And who are filling those 40,000 jobs now? They're basically the subject matter experts, the people who make things run. You know, the Congress will do some legislation, but somebody in an agency has to decide how that will be implemented, number one. And number two, you want people who are scientists, you want people who are experts in whatever category it is, basically making those decisions, not an additional, in my view, 40,000 political appointees.
Valid concerns to be thinking around these things. There are people who also look at the Harris campaign and say, if you start taxing unrealized gains, what will that mean in terms of market potential sales down the road? How do you figure that out? All these things are, again, talked about on the campaign trails. It's hard to go in and dig into details on these things, but I have heard people concerned and say that the market might sell off if that happens.
That would be a concern, and you said it in just the right way. How do you figure this out?
I don't know.
I have never figured out how you can actually compute what those untaxed returns would be, those unrealized gains. And so this seems to me to be one of those proposals that just doesn't really
You don't care about corporate rates? You think 28's okay?
The corporate tax rate, Joe, as you well know and has been discussed here many times, has been that the statutory rate is not the effective tax rate. The current effective tax rate is probably on the order of 18%.
So it's low enough in your view?
It's one of the lowest in the developed economies, and we have seen fabulous corporate profits, which have been benefiting from this low tax rate. Will the corporate tax rate go up substantially under a Harris administration? I don't know. I'm not connected to
capital gains.
To that. The capital gains tax rate is something that is also obviously being discussed, but the thing that actually collects more money has to do with growth, which historically has been the way the U.S. economy has grown and has the federal
then we'd have to talk
revenues.
Then we'd have to talk regulations.
That's right.
How about the filibuster?
Let me just finish the point. The federal revenues have typically grown best in the United States when the economy has grown. And having read the documents from both campaigns, what the Harris campaign includes are many different proposals to grow the economy. It's not just housing, but it's also credits for manufacturing and a variety of other things that would get the economy moving in a stronger way.
So government assistance for the private sector you think is more important than less regulation?
The regulation that we have in place is not perfect. We all understand that. However, I think that when you look at other economies where regulation has receded, there are problems. So, for example, I believe that we do need regulation focusing in on making sure that the free market, I'm a capitalist, I believe in free markets, but any economic historian will tell you that an unbridled free market creates problems. Okay. And I think that some degree of regulation is appropriate. I'll give you just one example. We had some breakdowns in regulation which helped trigger the global financial crisis. And we have had some adjustments to that since then, and we have largely avoided big problems. Now, we can talk about Silicon Valley Bank and so on, and many people will point to that and say the regulators weren't doing their job. So to have a situation where regulation just basically eases even more in some industries is problematic. And I think you need to look at it industry by industry to make a determination.
It's just not a huge leap for a lot of people that the co-author of the even bigger Green New Deal, along with one of the most liberal voting records in the Senate, isn't immediately thought to be pro-business more than what we saw in the first Trump presidency.
Yeah, well, you know,
I mean, it's just not a given that someone's going to just nod while you're saying that.
Well,
for me.
Yeah, sure. No, I hear you. And I think we also have to recognize that the last time Vice President Harris was in a national campaign by herself, she was in the primary. And what we know in any primary situation, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, there will be people who will lean over in one direction to appeal to their base. And I think as vice president and looking at how the Biden administration has governed the economy, it's been pretty good. The three legislative accomplishments address major long-term deficits in the United States in investment. We weren't investing enough for 40 years in public infrastructure. One of the major pieces of legislation addressed that. The CHIPS Act addresses investment in semiconductors and science. And you asked about, the so-called Green New Deal. The IRA legislation does address investment in green energy, but it also addresses how do you enhance all energy and how do you mitigate climate change. By the way, the other thing that the IRA does address is keeping pharmaceutical prices as low as possible.
Abby, before we let you go, with all of these questions and big issues, why is the VIX not more active? Why is there not more volatility? And what would you tell people to do ahead of the election, invest or not?
Yeah, I think the VIX has done what it's done because the underlying fundamentals of the economy have been solid. This is an economy growing at 3%, creating jobs. Inflation has come down from about 9% to roughly 2%. So investors.
But if all of this is resting on this election, if you're that convinced of it, what would you tell people to do ahead of it? Buy or not?
I don't think there has been a change in focus yet. I think right now investors are looking very much at the economic data coming out right now, the corporate profit data likely to be reported over the next few weeks, and it looks good. This economy is actually very, very solid. We have a friendly Fed now, and I think investors are just looking at that, and when they turn their attention to some of their other issues, I do expect the volatility to increase, and I think that that's when you see that this is more of a trading range. Do I hope that equity prices ultimately move higher? Of course I do, but I think we need to be realistic about what the next several months might bring.
Abby, thank you for coming in. Abby Joseph Cohen.
Next on Squawk Pod, it is October 7th, again, 1 year since the Hamas terror attack in Israel and the conversations that arose from that shocking event in our institutions, corporate, academic, shook many of the diversity and inclusion policies in place. Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League weighs in on the lost opportunities of a necessary discussion born out of tragedy.
Many of these DEI programs just didn't address anti-Semitism. They, put people in these sort of oppression Olympics, and you're either in team oppressor or team oppressed.
This is Squawk Pod.
Stand by, Joe. His mic, cue.
It is 1 year now since the tragic events on October 7th in Israel, and since then the Anti-Defamation League reports that there have been over 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, a 200% increase since the year before. Joining us now is Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the ADL. Jonathan, good to have you on this morning. Tough to think back, and it doesn't seem very long ago, and I guess one of the reasons is we still have hostages, that the nightmare continues, but it continues for a lot of people. You said something off camera about a day of, what is it? It's
a week of rage.
A week of rage on college campuses. And then initially I was going to say, okay, 1,200 people slaughtered, 100 hostages. It's not rage about that incident. But then I do see in the aftermath, tens of thousands of people have lost their lives too. So it's just, it's not clear to me exactly how we can look at this. Although without the initial incident, would there be 41,000 Gazans dead without the original incident?
Of course not. Look, this is a solemn day, and we need to ensure that we remember those people who were killed. The 1,200 murdered, slaughtered, like you said, the 5,000 plus wounded, and the 101 hostages still there.
They didn't do anything other than go to a music festival.
Or wake up in the morning. Or feed breakfast to their children, or elderly people at a bus stop, right, waiting to take a trip, gunned down in cold blood. But here's the thing. Think about 9/11, right? Nearly 3,000 Americans were killed in the single worst act of terror ever perpetrated on our shores. And on that day, on 9/11, we remember them. Now, it's true that 1 million plus people were killed in the ensuing years in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's true that thousands and thousands of U.S. servicemen were killed, men and women. By the way, coalition forces too. But on 9/11, we honor the memory of those who were killed. And that's it, Joe. No rationalization, no equivocation. So what I would say to leaders today, corporate leaders, elected officials, college presidents, on this day, you remember those innocent 1,200 people. No equivocation, no rationalization. There will be time to talk about the innocents, and every innocent life lost is a world destroyed. But there will be time to talk about them. Today, you remember the Jews who were killed. That's why we're here.
What we saw over the last year, and there were times that it was tough to watch college campuses.
Yeah.
We're not seeing that now, but is the undercurrents, has there been any change in the underlying amount of anti-Semitism? Are kids still scared to go to classes? Are they still threatening?
Look,
are these things happening still?
Last year was like an avalanche of anti-Semitism on these campuses, nearly a 500% increase year over year. In the ensuing months that happened over the summer, college administrators got smart, and many of them adapted their codes of conduct. They instituted new rules where they needed to. So we haven't yet seen the encampments again. That's true. So that's the good news. The bad news is we also haven't yet seen enforcement. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out this week. Joe, you mentioned it. These pro-Hamas groups on campus are literally the same groups that honored, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas who was killed, or Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah. The same groups bring out Hamas and Hezbollah flags, Joe. We will see what they do this week. And if they violate the rules, I hope the college presidents will enforce consequences.
Can I ask you about DEI? Because I look at
Sure.
October 7th as a tipping point. I mean, there had been a raging debate about DEI prior to October 7th.
Right.
But in the aftermath of October 7th, things, I think, shifted, and there was even a greater backlash. So there was, Ron DeSantis and Disney prior, and you look at Target and Bud Light and the like. But after October 7th, I think there was a view, and I'm curious what you think about this, among business leaders, many of whom were Jewish, who had been big supporters of DEI programs and supporting minorities. And there was a view, and Bret Stephens, I think, reflected this over the weekend in the New York Times, that there wasn't reciprocity in the same way.
Right.
And that led to a rethinking of some of these programs in a way that I don't think we talk about on TV or is actually talked about in public very often.
Look, I think it's a very good point, and Brett did have a brilliant column on Saturday morning. You can't really say that you're pushing inclusion if you don't, Andrew, actually include everybody. And what these corporate CEOs found out is something that actually we knew at ADL, that many of these DEI programs just didn't address anti-Semitism. They, put people oftentimes in these sort of oppression Olympics.
Right.
And you're either in team oppressor or team oppressed. Mm-hmm. And for reasons that are a bit inexplicable to me, the Jews were always on team oppressor. And that meant that anti-Semitism, despite the fact that it's the largest percentage of faith-motivated hate crimes in this country, wasn't included. The fact that Jews have this history of trauma that lasts thousands of years, not included. That's a problem. And so I think many companies are reconsidering it. Many of them are now also adopting these positions of institutional neutrality because they feel like they've gone too far out over their skis.
Does institutional neutrality work? Because that is the same thing that college, university campuses use.
Number one,
administrations.
It's a good question, Becky. I will say diversity matters. I believe in diversity education, but it's got to be done right. But to your point, institutional neutrality is good. Moral clarity is better. And moral clarity means, again, when we see over 1,200 people slaughtered, by the way, not just Israeli Jews, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, right? People of different ethnicities, including Arabs, then you simply say this is wrong. No equivocation, no rationalization. So
but that's my point. Institutional neutrality is what they've been using. You don't think that's
I don't think it's enough. It's an insufficient condition. I think moral clarity is better. And look, if our college presidents had demonstrated that before Congress, before their own students, I don't think we'd be in this mess to a certain degree.
The college presidents are presiding over an entire infrastructure that seems to breed this for some reason. And we didn't really see the protests. We saw some, but it was mostly on college campuses. It's in that environment. Are we ever going to be able to fix our college campuses?
We have to.
How? It's not just the college presidents, it's every tenured left-wing academic that's been hired over the past 30 years.
Look, we need systems change.
Exclusively left-wing academic, almost.
Look, we need systems change on these campuses. We need culture change on these campuses. And it didn't happen overnight on the front end, and we're not going to fix it overnight on the back end. But as I think about this myself, again, it's administrators, it's faculty members, it's the student bodies. But then I also think, Joe, what can we do? Like at ADL, we have undertaken more lawsuits in the past year than in the prior 100+ years, many of them against universities and K-12 school districts, right? We have used to play only an inside game, talking quietly. Now we're driving an outside game with our campus report card. What I would say for us at ADL and for all these groups, in the wake of 10/7, it's a wake-up call, and you've got to innovate, you've got to take risks, if we're going to try to fix this thing once and for all.
You could fire every current college president and not one thing would change based on what's underneath, what's, again, festering on college campuses.
This is a culture issue. So there's not one tactical thing you can do. Firing, Liz McGill at Penn, or I think technically she resigned, that didn't change the issues. It requires a top to bottom, holistic approach, and we're still waiting to see that fully rolled out at campuses across the country.
I would ask you about, we're talking about the Middle East every day. I don't know whether you have opinions about what Israel does from here on out, about the response that we're seeing from the
Well,
US
I will say
on these
this.
things. Yeah.
I will say this, and I've seen this on some other, shows this morning. Israel, I'm not a military strategist, but Israel needed to respond like America did after Pearl Harbor. And after America attacked Japan after Pearl Harbor, nobody said to President Roosevelt, what's your day after plan for Japan? That was not the question at hand. After the Germans were incinerating Jews in the ovens, bombing London to smithereens, nobody said, Churchill, what's your plan the day after? Look, this is a moment where the Israelis are facing sheer evil. It may be perpetrated by Iran, but it's coming from Gaza, from Lebanon. The Israelis have to respond. I just think I've seen a lot of hand-wringing this morning. Well, what's Bibi's plan? Look, whether or not you like Bibi Netanyahu, Israel needs to deal with existential threats, organizations and governments that want to annihilate them. Let them do what they need to do. I just think everybody being an armchair quarterback doesn't help the cause.
And you've got a country like Iran that the stated objective is to obliterate the state of Israel and kill all, and they're this close to a nuclear weapon.
They put militias surrounding the country. What would we do if Ottawa said our stated policy is to destroy the United States of America?
You would not let Ottawa get a nuclear bomb.
I think we would do a lot of things, and no one would say, what's the day after plan? Who's the next prime minister after Trudeau? We would simply say, we need to respond to this threat. Right. We need to see more of that.
Thank you, Donovan.
Appreciate you.
Good to see you this morning.
And that is the pod for today. Thank you, as always, for listening, and thanks for starting your week with us here. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern. Follow Squawk Pod wherever you get your podcasts, and you can listen anytime. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.